started. So my name is Ankur Patel. I'm the Director of Advancement for Hindu University of America. And today's webinar is on Hindu threads through America's fabric. Kind of a cool concept. And growing up in the West, I didn't know how much Hinduism, Sanatana Dharma, our rishis, our gurus impacted and really shaped some fundamental parts of American spirituality. And our special guest today, Philip Goldberg, is going to get into this. He's the author of American Veda. He's got his own amazing journey that hopefully we'll get we'll hear from his own words. He's a public speaker, a workshop leader, spiritual counselor, meditation teacher. He's an ordained interfaith minister. He's got a great sense of humor. We had a great conversation yesterday on trying to track how the different phases of Hindu influence and Sanatana Dharma came to America. And we'll get into all of that shortly. And I don't know, we're going to take some questions as we get into it. You know, you can put your questions in the Q&A box, but I definitely want to start with, you know, the overview of Philip Goldberg. How did you get into Sanatana Dharma, your own story? And then through the webinar, we'll explore some of the individuals, right, the Indian and the Western folks who propagated the teachings of Sanatana Dharma and integrated them into the fabric of American society. So with that said, Philip, why don't you start us off on your own journey, and we'll talk about the many ways that it's impacted and gone through all the way to Hindu University of America in this webinar.
I'm kind of representative of the whole story in a sense. I'll give you the short version. I was raised in New York City by atheists who had no use for anything we think of as religion and spirituality. But in the 60s, when I was a student, I was part of the generation that was searching for different answers to the big questions of life, and because nothing seemed satisfying. Neither, you know, all the different sources the adults were were trying to tell us represent, you know, truth and the good life. And so as part of my own seeking to figure out how to live in the world and what it's all about, I was one of those people who discovered the teachings that came to us from India. First, I was reading books on Buddhism, and Zen was very popular back then. And then texts, mostly at first, it was Western writers, generation or two older than I was, people like Aldous Huxley and Joseph Campbell, who are part of the course that I'll be teaching, had discovered Vedanta particularly, and the practices of yoga, and wrote about them. And we looked up to those people, and if they were into such things, then this was worth exploring. And so I did, and I got hooked. I just read everything I could because it made so much sense. And I remember thinking, well, if this is what religion is about, then I've been misled. There's something here that's beyond what we think of as religion. You could look at this as a science of consciousness. You could look at this as a great text or textual basis analysis for how to live a good life and a fulfilled life, a life that aspires to the highest attainments of inner reality. And it all just seemed logical and sensible to me. And one of the things that really appealed to my rebellious and counterculture nature was that none of the teachings I read, because I went from those Western writers, into reading the Gita and the Upanishads and, you know, some of the more direct sources. And then the gurus who started to come here, I sought those out. And no one ever asked me to believe something I found hard to believe. No one said you must have faith. No one said if you believe in me, you know, you'll be saved, and you know all your sins will disappear. It was always very empirical. It was, this is what our rishis have discovered. This is what we're passing down. These are the revelations, the insights. If they make sense to you, pursue it and apply logic, apply reason. But most of all, experience through practice what the yogis are advising. And so I took up meditation practices and other ancillary yogic practices. And it was very empirical. And I said, oh, okay, this stuff works. Therefore, the ideas might have some value, material, practical value in life. And that was how it all started for me. I became deeply committed. I became I spent a lot of time with Maharishi Mahesh Yogi back in the late 60s and early 70s. I became a teacher of that. And then from there, it just became a lifetime study. And as I became and a lifetime of practices and sadhana. When I turned to writing professionally, eventually I realized these teachings were having a much bigger impact than just me and my weird friends. And so I started doing research on the whole history of it and the impact of it. And that led to American Veda eventually. That's the overview.
Great, great. And you know, in our conversation just yesterday, we talked about, and you kind of talked about it right now, the phases that Sanatana Dharma, the texts, the different emissaries, representatives. I don't know if you want to kind of thumbnail us through that, kind of the way that you see it. And I know this is different than the way you teach your course, but I think just giving that overview to people who are just joining us for the webinar.
Yeah, in the course, I organized it slightly differently than the way I organized American Veda and the way I can summarize it chronologically. Because rather than do it chronologically, I did it in groupings of the kind of the main transmitters, the main disseminators in categories of how the teachings came here. Chronologically, of course, you know, it goes back. One of the ironies of the history is that during the British colonial period, the scholars were sort of assigned, scholars and theologians were assigned to study Hinduism, to study what they would have thought was a primitive religion of the conquered people of India, so they could better rule and better missionize and convert people. And the irony is that out of that effort, some of those scholars realized there was great value in Sanatana Dharma, that there was something people in the West can learn from. And so some of what they were writing was very favorable and very appealing. And that started to spread. And so first German and British artists, poets, scholars, intellectuals started to find value in these things, and their work ended up coming to America in the early 19th century, late 18th, early 19th century, and eventually, mostly in the Boston area, which was then the sort of intellectual capital of America.
Right. We went from the England Transcendentalists to the New England Transcendentalists,
Yes,
right?
right. And then in New England, the group that came to be known as the American Transcendentalists in the mid-19th century, you know, those books came to them. Ralph Waldo Emerson is the most famous of those figures. And his father was an early adopter. His father was a minister. And he was reading books and translations from India, some of the earliest works. And the Unitarians in Boston were in touch with Ram Mohan Roy and those other people in what's called the Bengal Renaissance, the Hindu Renaissance. And so there was a lot of cross-fertilization. And those people started journals for the study of Asian religions and meetings and all that. And so Emerson grew up with that. And he was deeply affected by it. And through him, Henry David Thoreau became affected by it. And then we have the beginning of this lovely, interesting volley, because Thoreau was influenced by the Gita and other Vedic teachings and wrote about them. And then his work influenced Gandhi. And then Gandhi influenced Martin Luther King. And so you had this American India back and forth on a very fundamental level early on. So then after the influence of all the literature, in the late end of the 19th century, you have the beginning of the emissaries from India coming here. Of course, the first and most transformative was Swami Vivekananda in the 1890s. And then later, his swamis in the Ramakrishna order started to come here and teach Vedanta philosophy in centers. And then Paramahansa Yogananda came in 1920 and was the first of the teachers to move to America and make it its home. And then you had the 60s, the era I talked about before, when everything exploded and the immigration laws changed. So Indians could become citizens and the gurus could come and go easily. And we had this wave of swamis and yogacharyas and gurus coming, beginning in the 60s, running into the 70s. And then we have other evolving phases. And one of the things that's interesting is that if you look at all the gurus who came here and who had an impact, who developed a following, they all came from different sampradayas and different, they emphasized different aspects of the Hindu Dharma. And you realize just in looking at them, how diverse it is. People have exposure often to, one lineage, one parampara, one aspect of the teaching. In the last 15, 20 years, it's mostly Hatha Yoga. But if you look at the full range of what's come here and continues to come, you see, all kind, the real great diversity of the teachings, from strict Advaita Vedanta to tantric teachings and all the variations within that. And so, that's a fascinating thing in itself. So, there is a history that's always evolving, and it's always, there's always a new wrinkle being thrown in. And now, the latest wrinkle, a lot of the people on this who are with us right now are part of, because when the immigration laws changed, and eventually we had first, second generation American-born Hindus of Indian descent in America, the landscape changed once again. So it wasn't just gurus coming and going and Americans adopting, but you have what the scholars call the inheritors of the Hindu Dharma, people like you and others on the call, who live the Dharma in a different way. And so we now have temples all over the country. I mean, they did not exist, in the 60s. They didn't really start to arrive on the landscape until the 80s, and that those kind of things change, and now you have Hindu people born into the Hindu tradition representing the Dharma in a way that might have been that is different from in certain nuances from what people like me and others were taught by the gurus who were adapting the teachings for American culture.
Yeah, that's beautiful. So kind of we had the phase one was the texts and the translations and the adaptations, and you got into that. Phase two, the early emissaries of Vignandaji and other folks, and then phase three, the explosion in the 60s. Phase four, the Hatha Yoga, the kind of the application, and maybe now we're in this inheritors of Hindu Dharma phase. But what gets lost in the adaptation of Hinduism in America? And in each of the different phases, there's different aspects of it. So let me just
and that's an ongoing question, and people will have different views on that. I mean, it's an ongoing debate, but it's an old one. You see people debating that in the early 20th century when the only representatives here were the early swamis trained in the Ramakrishna Vivekananda tradition in Bellarmut outside of, Calcutta. And those teachers are still with us. The current generation of teachers in what we in the West call the Vedanta Society and Ramakrishna Mission in India, they're representing, an aspect of Vedanta philosophy mainly. And, they were adapting early on. Vivekananda adapted to America. And then, I wrote a biography of Yogananda. You could see it behind me here. And I saw him in the 1920s and 30s adapting to American culture when you want to get an audience, when you want to appeal to people, you say, well, what are they interested in? What will, and the teachings are so diverse and so universal that if somebody, wants to improve their health, well, there's aspects of Hindu Dharma you can emphasize. If somebody is, like Americans are, especially back in Yogananda's day, they wanted self-improvement. They wanted to have a better career. They wanted a better marriage. Well, you can discuss Hindu Dharma in those terms. The difference between, well, let me put it this way, is something lost? If you look at it one way, sometimes these adaptations look like they're leaving stuff out, so you're losing something. But the best of the teachers gave people, this is what in Sanskrit is called upaya, is skillful means, reaching people at the level they're at. So if somebody wants to reduce stress, and you say, okay, do some yoga asanas, learn to meditate, and that's all they're interested in. You could say, well, that's watering down the teachings, you're leaving stuff out. But the skillful teachers gave people what was their most pressing need. They met that need and then said, and there's more to it. Look, you can look into it. So the best Hatha Yoga teachers, they give people the physical practices. They, people want better health. They want to look better. But then they say, there's much more to this body of teaching. You can just take take this and leave it, or you can look for a more fulfilled life. You can look for higher teachings. You can learn more. And so whether something is lost depends a lot on who's transmitting the teaching. What I'm mostly concerned about, and I think we all should be, is when the teachings get distorted or corrupted, often for commercial reasons, just to, to sell something, but sometimes just out of ignorance. It says in the Gita, these teachings get lost over time, and so those of us who care, I think, should pay attention and call out distortions when they're there, and always remind people of the fullness of what's possible to learn from these teachings, as opposed to the limited view they might have gotten.
Yeah, glad you put it, the physical cart before the spiritual horse, but I appreciate how you framed it also, whatever aspects bring people in and open up the mind, that's really into it. And one of the cool things that we discussed, and maybe you could get into, is kind of the art and the music, right? From Joseph Campbell and the way, and there's a little bit of nebulous, were people actually directly influenced, or is it the parampara, the lineage, or how? Maybe you could get into that, because and Kalanji was trying to make that broader connection, right? We know Beatles, but some of these other popular movies in a different way also.
The teachings, this is a critical point, because we've talked, obviously the most important source of transmission, in addition to the literature, the texts, was the emissaries who came here, the great ambassadors of the Dharma, the gurus who came, and swamis who represent the teachings. They influenced Americans. Those Americans who adopted the teachings and whose lives were transformed by them, they told their friends, they told their families. And so in a sense, they became emissaries, like I did, and so many other people did. Oh, you should know about this. You should read this book. You should go hear this teacher. This is a different way of looking at things. And so the word spreads. As some of those people who were influenced by the teachings were prominent people, or became prominent people, famous people, and they adapted the teachings to their own fields of expertise, their own disciplines, and express them, sometimes very explicitly. If you look at Emerson and Thoreau, for example, the other Transcendentalists, there's aspects of their written work where they talk about what they're learning from Hinduism and Buddhism. And they quote passages, and they extol the virtues of the Gita and all this. But there's others where other aspects of their work where if you know enough, you can see the influence, but it's not stated. It's just adapted. So they might write a poem, they might write an essay, and their perspective has been informed by Hinduism, by Dharmic teachings, but they don't necessarily have to state it. It's just part of how they see the world. And you see that a lot in Emerson. You see it in other teachers later on in the whole what was called the New Thought movement, which we'll discuss. And you see it today. You can go to certain churches and places like that are very progressive, and you say, somewhere along the line, somebody was exposed to Dharmic teachings, and it changed how they express their own spiritual perspective. And so you see that, and we'll talk about those specifically in the course. So that kind of pattern affected not just philosophers, but scientists. Some of the great physicists were deeply influenced by Vedantic views. Psychologists, going back to William James, who knew Vivekananda, and Carl Jung, and then the Americans of the 50s and 60s who transformed psychology by bringing in a spiritual dimension that they got from studying the Eastern traditions. And it became humanistic psychology and transpersonal psychology. And also artists. So an artist is always, absorbing influences from the outside, whether they, are poets, like T.S. Eliot studied Sanskrit at Harvard. And you can see in some of his writings references to the Gita, quoting Krishna. Yeats, the great Irish poet, he actually worked with a guru to do translations of the Upanishads. You see it in their work. Some of the great novelists, Hermann Hesse, we'll talk about Hermann Hesse, we'll talk about Somerset Maugham, who wrote The Razor's Edge, where there's a guru figure based on Ramana Maharshi, and J.D. Salinger, who studied with one of the Vedanta Society swamis in New York and wrote very explicitly about it in his novels. And then, movie making. I was deeply influenced when I was in college. Before I even ever read anything about Indian philosophy, I saw the movies of Satyajit Ray, the great Indian Bengali filmmaker who lived on the same block that Yogananda did in Calcutta. And his movies, especially the one set in Varanasi, I said, oh, I want to go there someday. And so his influence, and then the influence of people like we mentioned intellectuals, people like Joseph Campbell, who studied with Swami Nikhilananda in New York. His whole body of work was influenced by his early studies of Hindu Dharma. And he became, one of the most famous public intellectuals in America. Same with Houston Smith, who wrote the famous, Aparahita, who wrote one of the most important textbooks about a religion. They studied with the Swamis from the Vedanta Society, and Joseph Campbell had a huge influence. His study of the world's literature and mythology, which came to be known as the hero's journey, influenced a lot of storytellers and filmmakers, including George Lucas. So Star Wars has themes based on Joseph Campbell's work, which in turn borrows from and draws from Dharmic teachings. It's unknown whether George Lucas had any direct influence of Vedanta or any of that, but he got it at the very least secondhand through Joseph Campbell. So you see that kind of line of influence, and music is one of the big ones. So the music you were playing when we started was one of the first. Yehudi Menuhin, the great violinist, classical violinist, he brought BKS Iyengar to the West because he studied yoga with him when he was touring in India. And he arranged for Ravi Shankar to come to the West and give concerts. And Menuhin and Ravi Shankar came together for an album called West Meets East. It won a Grammy Award in 1967. This was the beginning of Americans getting to know Indian music. And then, of course, even more important was when Ravi Shankar met first certain jazz musicians like John Coltrane, but George Harrison. And it was George Harrison's, I love telling this stuff, so I have to stop myself from going into too much detail. But it was George Harrison's discovery of the sitar and the sound of the sitar made him want to study it. And he, because he was one of the most famous people on the planet with the Beatles, he got Ravi Shankar to be his teacher and went to India and studied with Ravi Shankar. And it was there that he read Yogananda's autobiography of a yogi and Vivekananda's book on Raja Yoga. And George became as much a Hindu as a Westerner could be, you know, and that led to the Beatles learning transcendental meditation and going to the ashram in Rishikesh. And that was an explosive moment in the whole history of this Dharma coming into America, to the West in general, to the world, because the Beatles were world famous. And so music played a big role in this. And you hear it not only in the music, certain songs of the Beatles, so, you know, certain albums that people like John Coltrane had made, and of course Ravi Shankar's own fame and popularity. But you see it because in off stage, when they're not, when artists like the Beatles and Ravi Shankar talk about their music, they start to talk about Dharmic teachings and the influence it's had on them. John Lennon and George Harrison probably did more to spread the word about mantra meditation and its value, that because anything they said was quoted all around the world. So when they took up the practice, and later when George started to, when became a Krishna Bhakta, when he was involved with the Hare Krishna people, all this, you can't overestimate the impact that such things had through the arts, but also through the celebrity factor. The celebrity factor can trivialize things because the media loves their celebrities, but they also, you know, they can distort things and trivialize things, but they also reach people. And they reach people who otherwise would not be reached. So, you know, that's also a thing. And, you know, even Yogananda, long before there was rock and roll, long before there was, you know, mass media or anything like that, there was often articles written about Yogananda and his practices, his teachings, because a famous symphony conductor or opera singer became a devotee.
Nice. Yeah, so that nature of the transmission, right? The different threads and how it's, I love it. It's so interesting. And I haven't had the privilege of taking your course where I think you get into a lot more details, but maybe a few framing questions.
We'll give you a discount, Encore.
Actually, everyone is going to get a discount on the course if you sign up in the next days before Monday. Let me just drop it in the chat so you know what we're talking about. How Hindu Dharma Transformed America. So this is the course Philip is teaching next quarter at HUA starting October 5th. You can see it in the chat every Tuesday. And we're offering a short discount window of $100 off. So it's going to be $200. And obviously in a webinar, we can't get into the depth, and HUA, we have the learning management system. Phil uploads readings and links, and we make it interactive.
Videos too. I mean, it was one of the great things about being able to do it in this medium is I can show videos, you can, you know, so you'll hear and see a lot of the people we're talking about.
Yeah, so that's a short pitch on the course in the middle. We're starting to get some questions from folks in the Q&A box. Keep those coming in, and we'll get to some of those as we go on. But Phil, kind of the framing question, right? That nature of transmission, the difference between teaching and preaching, right? Where is it going? Kind of maybe if you want to give that summation a little bit before we get into questions from the audience.
Ever since American Veda came out, when I'm interviewed, people will often say, well, where's this going? So the book came out about 10 years ago, and I could not have predicted what it would be like now. And so, you know, I always used to say I specialized in looking at 200 years of the past. The future is for somebody else. I can't, you know, that's beyond my pay grade. But at the same time, you could see certain trends. And the other, you see trends that have been going on for 200 years, and you say, this will only continue. If you look at and this is an important part of why this is an important subject. It's not just that the teachings directly affect individuals like me. The Western adopters of this teaching. They have had a profound impact, a subtle one that many people don't even know exists, because when something seeps into the culture and becomes part of the fabric, you don't necessarily notice where it came from or what it's about, because the language changes and everything changes. So if you look at the trends in religion and spirituality since the 60s, but you know, even just the last 30, 40 years, there's this growing trends. And I talk about this in the first class of the course. You can identify certain trends. And those trends resemble, especially Vedanta philosophy and yoga philosophy and practice. So among other things, you see a trend toward people saying, oh, what's important to me about religion or my spirituality is not belief system, not dogma. I don't want to be told what to believe in. I want direct experience of the divine. I want inner transformation. That's what spirituality means to me. And so there's this move away from dogmatic religion toward experiential, personal, spiritual seeking, what scholars call questing, as opposed to nesting, as opposed to identifying with a religious institution. The primary identification is my own spiritual search. And that might mean nesting in a place. It might mean exploring. That's just one example. So you see these trends, this whole thing about Americans, especially young Americans, being spiritual but not religious, or being unaffiliated. People wonder what's going on here. The discovery of the teachings from the East, Hindu Dharma, Buddhist Dharma, Indic spirituality is largely responsible for that, because it gives people a doorway into the life of the spirit that's not rigid and dogmatic and is truly transformational. So you can aspire to moksha, you can aspire to, you know, the enlightened consciousness and the highest states of yoga, union, or you can just want a better life a more fulfilled life. But the methodologies that came to us from India and the way of framing them and understanding what we are, who we are, what our relationship to the cosmos is, that has transformed the landscape of America, even for people who never met a guru, never opened a Bhagavad Gita, don't even know, what we might be talking about, because they heard it from Oprah, or they heard it from their psychotherapist, or a teacher in a literature class or a philosophy class, and it opened some door into their mind. They read Somerset Maugham or J.D. Salinger or Emerson. Their psychologist might have studied with a guru. They're not teaching them Hinduism, they're just helping them live a better life. And they do it in a different way than somebody else might. And that's those subtle ways. One of the themes that runs through this whole thing is that Americans are very pragmatic. Americans can be chauvinistic and xenophobic, racist. That's all part of the history. And you look at the history I covered, and you see the gurus having to deal with all that stuff. It was not easy for, in many cases, to deal with racism and bigotry and all that, and resistance. Go back to India, all that. But the other half of America said, oh, you have something interesting to teach us? Come tell us. Come meet my friends. I'll help you. And oh, really? You have practices called meditation or, yoga asanas? Oh, yes, teach me. I want to learn. Maybe it'll help my life. So those two Americas, over the long run, the pragmatism, wins out. The stuff works. It makes sense. It holds up. There's even thousands of scientific studies demonstrating that these teachings have value. So people adopt them. And in many cases, they adopt them and they don't even think of them as spiritual. They just think of it as good health, or whatever.
Yeah. Wow. That was a great summary. We're getting questions. Please put them in the Q&A box as opposed to the chat. I'm trying to pull them out. Phil, just love it. I think, your course is going to make people's lives better if they take it. That's what it's feeling like to me.
I hope so. It makes my life better whenever I teach it.
So before we get into people's questions, let me ask you all a quick questions. Are you interested in enrolling in this course, enrolling in How Hindu Dharma Transformed America? Just click that yes, no, maybe I have questions, and we'll follow with folks. If you're having trouble registering, we'll walk you through it. Again, we're trying to be as easy to access and walk you through whatever's necessary as possible. And again, please put the questions in the Q&A box as opposed to the chat, even though I'm pulling them out. Phil, that was great. Kind of, I think, summed it up and really put it makes me more curious, right? But it also gives that sense of this is where we're at and what we're doing and where we're going. So I appreciate that a lot. Nehru asks, are Hindu temples necessary to follow Sanatana Dharma? So that's a general question, but earlier in the webinar, you talked about how there weren't mandirs in America, right? And then there are other places where mandirs have been destroyed purposefully and they've been reconstructed, but just maybe your overall take on.
No, well, the idea of a Hindu temple was, I'd never heard of such a thing. I mean, I knew they existed in India, but when I first took up these practices and everything, I don't think there were any. The few Hindus living here, they may have rented a place that didn't look like a Hindu temple, so they could, congregate and do puja and all that. But I don't remember there being Hindu temples at least till the late 70s. I remember I was in LA. I moved to Los Angeles in 82 or 3, and not too long after that, the Hindu temple in Malibu opened. And I'm going to tell this story. I and some of my friends, my yogi friends, who were all dharmic kind of people, we went to the opening, the public opening of the Hindu temple in Malibu, which is a beautiful place. And I remember being there and seeing all these, a lot of Western people dressed up to honor this new addition to the landscape, but a lot of Indian people, men in Nehru jackets, women in saris, who I didn't, at the time, I remember saying, oh yeah, we have we have people from India now in America, and here they are. And I heard behind me, it's going to sound terrible, but I hear voices behind me, and they're clearly teenage girls speaking in what in those days we would call Valley Girl accent. I'm not going to try and imitate it. And I thought, what are they doing here? And I turned around, and it was a group of Indian-born, no, not necessarily Indian-born, probably American-born teenage women, teenage girls of Indian descent in saris. And I realized, oh my God, there are American-born teenagers who, whose heritage this is. And that was a revelation. Well, obviously now, 30, 40 years later, this is commonplace. And those people now have children and grandchildren. And that, whether temples are necessary, that's up to the individual. They serve a purpose. I certainly like visiting them, especially when I go to India. I love going to temples. The only problem I have is going barefoot. But the atmosphere in a temple and the activities in temples, can be extremely valuable for people, especially, for certain people. It's not everybody's path, but they serve a good purpose, and they're helping to keep the tradition alive in a way that is different from a meditation center or a yoga studio, or even the centers in the lineages of the gurus who came here, because they tend to be adapted to Western architecture and style and all that.
Yeah, I'd just like to add, Hindu University of America is one of these institutions that we're building, and in whatever way that people can be exposed and share and transmit this knowledge of Sanatana Dharma, I think is important. Jay Bunsell, stalwart supporter, active member of a lot of important projects. He brings up Emerson and Thoreau, right? Speaking so highly of Hindu thought, but then you have a whole, and he uses the word cabal, right? European Indologists who are, and you mentioned it, actively trying to understand Sanatana Dharma, the scriptures, to then missionize, to conquer, to take over. How did that happen? And how did that trajectory split, right? And were the two groups working in isolation, or was there just bald-faced hypocrisy?
Well, in a sense, it's still, that kind of split is still with us. I mean, even in contemporary academia, and now I'm not an academic, so, there are better people to ask about the life in academia and the academic study of Hinduism and how it's taught and all that. And history, my specialty was coming to America. So the earlier history, I have to look into, but there are people who are specialists in that, and I would refer you to them. But obviously there are people sometimes the same person, sometimes the same scholar, or early scholar especially, would say, oh, the Vedas are so beautiful, and look at this, how wonderful this teachings from the Upanishads are. And at the same time, those people would still see Christianity as the summit of religion and want to convert the Hindus to the higher teaching of Jesus. So you see that split even not only among scholars, but within the same human being sometimes. And that missionary zeal was very powerful back in the day, and it wreaked a lot of havoc and caused a lot of damage. But at the same time, out of it came, people who transmitted the teachings in a way that made it possible for everybody to learn from and benefit from. So and so today, even in academia, from what I can see, you have people of Indian descent teaching about Hinduism and Indian history and all that. And you have many more people, born of European descent, mostly Christians, but also Jews, teaching because they're fascinated by it. And many of them in the current generation were people like me who had gurus and whose lives were sort of Hinduized, or they became yogis and went and lived in ashrams and took up the practices and then became scholars, then went back to graduate school. Those people, the practitioners, the scholar practitioners, are dedicated to teaching in an accurate and a respectful way. But there are others who are hostile to Hinduism, either in the name of Christianity or more often in the name of atheism and anti-religion. So a lot of the same people that you might identify as Hindu-phobic are also, they're just anti-religion. They don't have many good things to say about other religions either. So you see that kind of bias. And then you have people like, I have a podcast called Spirit Matters. And so we interview a lot of people. And not too long ago, we interviewed a Harvard scholar who's a Jesuit priest, but deeply influenced by Hinduism. And it's people like him who are able to have a foot in many doors, in many rooms, who are doing a great service to perpetuating Dharma, whereas others, are busy distorting and demonizing.
Sometimes dismantling.
It's just a mirror of American life in many other ways as well.
Yeah. Kumar Vadapartiji, thank you for signing up. Vardhanji, thank you for signing up for the course. Let me drop it in the chat again. You get to continue this conversation with Philip in the course. We'll walk you through signing up and getting registered and all of that. We have a $100 discount until Monday night. So now's the time to get into the course. Still got quite a few questions. You get a replay of this webinar. If you registered, and throughout the course, I mean, we can't go over everyone, right? Ishkan and Sriji, Prabhupadaji, and if you look at the course description, there's a lot of folks that we didn't get into.
Oh, yeah.
Do you want to talk about a little bit about that in the course, who you get into, who you don't get into, why or why not, rather than specifically?
Yeah, well, after the first sort of set up introductory thing, if I'm remembering correctly, the 10 sessions, the first few focus on the primary transmitters, who were the gurus who came here, the swamis, the yoga masters, and the the gurus who became household words to most of us. In the 60s and 70s, there were so many that I had to only give a thumbnail of each of them. Some were much more influential than others, but I tried to cover all the ones who had a significant following because, as we said earlier, to show the diversity of the teachings and the diversity of the populations they reached and their legacy. So some of the gurus who came, for whatever reason, the effectiveness of their teachings, the quality of disciples they had and their ability to carry it on after the teacher was gone, because very few of them are from the 70s are still alive, only one or two, and they're well, into their 80s and 90s. And whether they built enduring institutions, whether there was funding, all these things, affect whether the teachings survive after the passing of the founding guru. So there were many of those, 20, 25 that I mentioned. And their teachings persist in most cases. There were also teachers, great masters, who never came to America, who had a big impact. So we also talk about them. People like Sri Aurobindo and Ramana Maharshi. More people know about them now than knew about them in the West in their lifetimes, because those two died in 1950. That's 71 years ago. But people know them now. Their pictures are on, the people's bookshelves and altars. People are reading about them. People are making pilgrimage to South India, where Aurobindo and Rama. I take tour groups to India, and right before the pandemic, we were in both the Sri Aurobindo ashram in Pondicherry and in the Ramana Maharshi ashram in Tiruvannamalai. And people like Swami Shivananda and Krishnamacharya and Neem Karoli Baba, who influenced Ram Dass, who is probably the most well-known American adopter and transmitter. So those people deserve mention and study as well. And then, there are contemporary gurus who are having a big impact. So, Amma and Sri Ravi Shankar and Sadhguru, we talk about them as well. And then the course shifts into the Western transmitters, scientists, the philosophers, the doctors, the psychologists, the artists, and also some of American Western religious figures who opened the doors to Dharmic teachings, reaching Christians and Jews in the context of their own tradition. And so certain aspects of contemporary Christianity and Judaism there's been a shift in a direction that's been influenced by Hinduism and Buddhism. And that's a very interesting phenomenon in itself. You see Christian meditation now. You see, there's a guy, I'll play a video of him when we're in the course, called the Kirtan Rabbi, who does traditional Kirtan style chanting in Hebrew for his Jewish congregation, because he learned it from Kirtan masters in India. So that's the sort of range of the course. But all along, we'll talk about the implications of it and some of these delicate issues like what gets distorted and what doesn't.
Great. If you haven't filled out the poll, please do that. We had about 70 people fill it out. Lots of interest. Again, this course seems exciting. Glad some folks have already signed up. We're not going to get into general questions about the process of meditation, right? Though I understand the dismantling Hindutva, global Hindutva conference is on people's mind. Phil, if you want to talk about it, you can a little bit, but that's not what this is kind of focused on. But we kind of touched on it, right? The people who have adopted it, the people who are challenging it in the way that goes. So if you want to touch on that, you can. We're at the top of the hour. We went through most of the questions. I'm going through a little bit more. Phil, how are you feeling?
I'm fine. Whatever you want to talk about is fine with me. I'm not even looking at the Q&A list, so I'm leaving that to you.
Right. So this is how Hindu Dharma transformed America, right? It obviously had a global impact. We talked about Germany the other day. Atul Shah, Dr. Shah is asking about kind of the global impact. I know your focus is on the American Veda aspect of it, but if you
after American Veda came out, I would get emails or interviews and people say, what about Europe? What about, and I say, well, if someone wants to pay me, I'll be happy to go and research that, and write about it. But I do know, just from what I've been able to glean, the biggest impact was in America, just because America is what it is and what it was. But also the UK, obvious connection between the UK and India. And of course, people like the Beatles and other, certain scholars from the UK, and Germany, parts of Scandinavia and the Netherlands, mostly those northern Protestant countries in Europe were open to this, slightly less so the more Catholic countries of the South in Europe. But it is global. Look, there's Dharma in South America. Some of the teachers, like Yogananda, because of his reach, Autobiography of a Yogi is a global phenomenon. That book's been translated into more than 50 languages. And it's, as a result, there are centers in his lineage all over the world, most in America and Europe, but also elsewhere, South America and so forth. So a lot of the teachers found their way to South America. Even Hatha Yoga, one of, Krishnamacharya was a great innovator of Hatha Yoga, and he was very bold in essentially certifying a European woman to teach in his lineage back in the 30s, I think. And she ended up in Argentina. So, there are ways these teachings have found gotten into parts of Africa and South America, as well as Europe and America and Australia and so forth. But they spread. Something works, people will find it.
Yeah. Radhaji's kind of asking, you touched on Buddhist Dharma having impact, but some of the other Eastern kind of religions, or belief systems, views,
it's mostly
Taoism, did that have an effect?
All that, especially, in the 60s, we knew they were different, but they had a certain commonality. With the exception of Taoism, we knew they started in India. We knew Buddha was a yogi, and so but Zen Buddhism came from Japan, and Tibetan Buddhism came from Tibet, but they all have Indic roots. And so Hindu Dharma is very diverse, but there are certain threads in Vedanta and Tantra Kashmir Shaivism and yoga that attracted people. And the same is true of Buddhism. So a lot of the same people who were influenced by Zen and other forms of Buddhism were also very influenced by yoga and Vedanta. And they wrote about, so Alan Watts, for example, was a very popular translator and commentator back in the 60s and 70s. And he wrote about all these things. He started out writing a famous book about Zen, but he also wrote about Hinduism and Vedanta, and you could still find his videos online talking about all these things. And so what we realized is that all these teachings from the East were different in kind from what we thought of as religion in the West. But because of those teachings, we discovered there are branches, lesser known branches, even of the Western traditions, that are essentially more like Hinduism than they are like Christianity or mainstream Judaism, what we call the mystical branches. So if you look at certain Christian mystics who were iconoclasts and mistreated and ostracized by the mainstream in their era, some of them sound like Adi Shankaracharya, in their way they frame their connection to divinity. So we learn through the East of these universal spiritual teachings. And some people are happy following the forms that they were born into and adapting them. And some people are more comfortable following Hindu forms or Buddhist forms or whatever. And one of the transformations that's come is the acknowledgement of the individuality of the spiritual search and this notion of Ishtadevata, of finding the form that appeals to you.
Nice. We're honored to have Swami Chidanandaji from Himachal Pradesh joining us today. He has a specific question. Yeah, I feel, I guess you're familiar. No, Swamiji's asking, and this is kind of going back, and it's such a thing that a lot of people are asking, maybe we'll take this one last time. Does the discomfort that a lot of people, including many of Indian origin, have with Hindutva have some basis? Do we need to sympathize with them? And Vinayak is also asking, how is there the split between the good and the bad? Why there's so much hatred of Hindu Dharma being spread, even in the academic space and conferences? Maybe you can, last time we're going to address this today.
I'm
please.
Not in the academic world. And I have to say, it's very distressing for me to experience a lot of this because I have this deep love and affection for India and obviously a deep connection with Hindu Dharma. I don't like hatred or bigotry in any form. And a lot of, sometimes you hear things being said in the name of Hindutva or Hinduism, often it's secondhand, so I don't know what to believe. But it doesn't sound, it sounds antithetical to the spirit of Hindu Dharma that I love, and that means a lot to me. And that is not unlike a good Christian who loves Jesus being upset with some of the things that are done in the name of Jesus or Christianity. So there's always going to be distortions. There's always going to be people using religion for nefarious purposes. I've been accused of being Hindutva. I don't even know what that means, just because I extol the value of Hinduism and Hindu Dharma. So somebody will accuse me of being Hindutva. And then I'll say something and people will say I'm a sellout. So I don't know, I think, it's distressing, a lot of what's going on, but I'm not enough of an expert to, take a strong opinion. I'm often asked about Indian politics as if I should know, because I have a connection. I take tour groups there and I know about Indian philosophy and something of Indian history, but I find Indian politics a little too complicated for my, it's even more complicated than American politics. So the intersection of religion and politics is a very messy and controversial one. So I try not to, say too much because I don't know enough.
I just agree with you. It's distressing. What we're trying to do at Hindu University of America is build this platform so we get at the truth of the matter. We elevate people like yourself who are doing research, sharing knowledge, continuing the threads and transmitting the Dharma in a way that's open and accessible, that's loving and caring, that's dharmic in its approach.
And I tell you, one of the things that's distressing for me is I know a lot of Hindu Americans, and some of them are very good friends of mine. And those who are active in, trying to preserve and protect the Dharma, or at least to combat Hindu-phobic people, they're then accused, they're put in, they're called bigots, and they're called, they're labeled Hindutva as, and the people assume they hate Muslims and all this. And I know these people, they're being misrepresented, and that's very disturbing to me.
Okay, yeah. A couple kind of, I don't know, course questions. We're going to cover the connection of Sanatana Dharma and the correlation quantum physics, the metaphysical nature of stuff, and who are the folks who
we can't go into that in depth, but I do talk about the physics, the physicists who were influenced by Sanatana Dharma and in many cases propagated it through their books. I'll talk about Fritz Capra's Tao of Physics, and I always love to show the Shiva Nataraj at CERN at the nuclear accelerator lab in Switzerland. So we talk about it, but it's not like we have time to go into the nuances of quantum physics and all that. I leave that to people who know physics.
I kind of have two general questions. What is your just general take on the definition of Dharma? What is Dharma, and is material or emotional success in life prerequisite to be ready for Dharma?
Oh, well, I don't think so. When I first got into these teachings, and I read the Gita, there was one passage in the Gita. There are a few that had a huge impact on me to this day. And one of them was where Krishna tells Arjuna, better to die in one's own Dharma. The Dharma of another brings danger. And I was young and very suspicious of religion and people telling me what to do and how I had to live. So when I understood the importance of discerning your own Dharma and the different layers of Dharma in life, and that these teachings were not only telling me it's okay to be true to your own inclinations, your own callings, your own inner GPS, so to speak, but you must. It's better to do that. It's better for you, and it's better for your family. It's better for your society. It's better for your spiritual growth to be in tune with and faithful to Dharma. And what does Dharma mean? Well, there's the universal Dharma of everybody being attuned to the divine, however we imagine it to be or perceive it to be. To me, that means being a yogi, to do everything we can in our sadhana and in our activity in life to attune ourselves to the highest within us, to this unitive state of yoga, and to, in that consciousness, discern right action, dharmic action. So to me, that it's fundamental. It's fundamental to living a good, prosperous life in the world, and it's fundamental to living a deep spiritual life, both of which I think we should aspire to.
Nice.
One of the interesting things about this transmission is a lot of the main emissaries were sannyasis, but the ones who had an impact were the ones who knew they weren't teaching primarily other monks. They were teaching householders. And so they adapted the teachings. They were, in many cases, teachings they learned in a monastic setting, in the ashram. But they recognized that these teachings had value to the vast majority of humanity who are busy raising families and running a business and having a career and all that. So that's one way these teachings were adapted to the modern world, to the modern version of Dharma in the world, to the, to Artha and, Dharma and Kama, to the aims of worldly life, as well as, achieving moksha and liberation. And so you see in their attempt to adapt, not just to householder life, to the householders who became their students and followers, but to American householder life, which is different from Indian householder life, and to 20th century householder life, which was very different from 19th century and 18th century life, and to urban life, which is very different from village life. And this makes the application of these teachings and how they're adapted, both a challenge and something very interesting to look into.
We have Vijayadhar bringing up Diana X, A New Religious America. So I guess you're familiar with the book. Is perhaps one book that traces the influence of different religions. Right there on my shelf. Got it. So please tell us, and the question is, do you believe the American society is becoming more accepting of different religious beliefs?
She's one of the people at Harvard. Unfortunately, she's one of the only people I wanted to interview for American Veda that I couldn't get to. But she's a very prominent voice and an important voice, and one of the scholars, really high-level, reputable academics who early in her career, at a time when it was not that common, spent a lot of time in India, wrote in a very informed way about India and Hinduism and its traditions, and started the Pluralism Project at Harvard, which I can't say this for sure, but it looks like it had the orientation toward pluralism and inclusivity in spiritual traditions draws a lot from Hindu Dharma in the way these things are framed. So her book, what's it called again? New Religion in America. I forget.
A New Religious America.
New Religious America. It's must be 40 years old at least by now, but she was recording some of what we talked about before, the changes in the religious landscape in America, and that included in her writings some of the earliest Hindu temples and places of worship. So it was an important book, and probably, you know, still holds up.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So Radha's kind of asking on the individual level, how do you think we should spread accurate teachings of Hinduism and recognize the distortions? How do we recognize what is being distorted? And then that kind of dovetails into, if you don't know the lineage, the history, the scriptures,
No,
how do you? But
no, and some of it is difficult to discern, and some of it gets very nuanced because, you know, one person can be offended by something they consider a distortion, and somebody else can look at the same thing and say, well, on the other hand, maybe it's just a reasonable adaptation to reach certain people. So we have to draw the line. So the yoga scene now, for example, you know, turning the yoga tradition into a form of physical fitness, and, you know, bringing in all kinds of stuff, or reducing yoga to just asana practice, that's a distortion in the sense that it's a distortion by omission. It leaves out so much. And then you think, okay, but some people just want that, and they'll benefit, and they'll have better health, and they'll, you know, have a stronger body, and that's good for them. I know high-level yoga teachers who started because they had back pain. They didn't know anything about yoga, but they went to get help with their back pain or their stiff neck or, you know, their stress, and they ended up becoming absorbed in the teachings and going to India and studying with genuine yoga masters and becoming emissaries themselves. So you never know what's going to open somebody's eyes. Somebody can go to a yoga class to have a workout, and then while they're sitting in silence or lying down in silence at the end of a physical asana class, have a very transcendent experience and say, well, what was that about? Because the properly done asanas and pranayama practices can lead to that. Or somebody can just stumble into a deeper meditative practice because they had the right teacher in the yoga class, or they saw a sign for the meditation class or the class on the Yoga Sutras, and they said, oh, what's that? I'll go to that too. So these can be door openers, even if they seem to be trivializations and distortions. Yogananda got a lot of people to come to his lectures when he talked about higher consciousness for greater success in life. But he never compromised on the teachings. He just adapted them. And that's the difference. It's, do the teachers use skillful methods to reach people in where they are, but also point them, let them know there's more if they want it, and make it available. That's a critical difference. And sometimes the other thing to me that upsets me is calling something yoga that's nothing more than somebody's idea of exercise and a good time or stress reduction. Reduce that kind of reductionism. And it's not just yoga. I mean, back in the day when I learned to teach transcendental meditation, which is, came from the tradition. We trace that tradition back to Adi Shankaracharya. And, it's a traditional form of meditation practice that in India would be called Bhavati Dhyan. And we were teaching higher consciousness. And then, people just wanted to lower their blood pressure. And you said, okay, if that's what you want here, but there's more to it. And we were trained to say there's more to it. And then when meditation became popular and doctors and psychologists were inventing their own forms and saying it's the same thing, that's a distortion that's very upsetting, because it's not the same thing and they're leaving stuff out. So there's ways of looking at this, but you have to be well informed yourself in order to make those judgments and discernments. And it's not always easy. But I always err on the side of inclusion. If something has the possibility of leading somebody to, Dharmic teachings in all their integrity, then maybe it's a door opener and we can let it, give it a break.
Yeah, you never know what is going to be transformational, what's going to open the door. So true,
Yeah.
so true. So maybe this class, How Hindu Dharma Transformed America, is one way that you can get plugged in. I dropped it in the chat one last time. Thank you for filling out the poll. Sorry we didn't get to all of your questions, but maybe Phil, if you want to wrap it up with why people should take the course and how it is going to impact their lives. I think that's the take-home message.
Well,
that you can
how
leave
it
folks with.
will impact your life depends on you and where you're at in your own spiritual journey, and the how much you already know and how much you want to know and what you want to know. But you will, at the very least, come away with a profound appreciation for the universal quality of Hindu Dharma and its impact, subtle impact and profound impact on America, and its potential to have an even more transformative impact in the future. So I think, you'll have appreciation for that, and I hope a deeper commitment to your own sadhana and your own spiritual inquiry. I hope that it will inspire you, in that direction to not only know more about the tradition, but to live it. Because if it's not lived, it's just ideas, and the many ways it can be lived. So
Beautiful.
yeah, and we have fun. There's a lot of fun, and the 2 times I taught it, one of the things that was really interesting to me was the surprises, because depending on who's in the class, certain things come up. And I end up learning a lot, and the conversation goes in directions I hadn't anticipated. So that's why I look forward to it myself.
Wonderful. All right, folks. Thank you for joining us for this webinar. We'll have another one next Saturday. Hopefully we will see you in How Hindu Dharma Transformed America with Philip Goldberg, our panelist for today. Again, thank you for sharing the story and making the connections and going through all the threads and how it's connected. It was beautiful. I think a lot of people really appreciated this webinar.
It was
We'll send the recording
fun.
out.
Thanks everybody for being with us. And I wish I could have answered all the questions, or at least heard them. And I hope to see you in the course itself, or someplace else.
Dhanyawad. Thank you all.